people are joining us. Welcome to this Reviewer Credits webinar. You're all very welcome. Thank you for joining us. Great to see you here. Fantastic. Let us know in the chat, like where you're from. Let me just open the chat box, make sure everybody can access the chat. Do tell us where you're from, where you're joining us from today. That would be absolutely great. I'm Gareth. In a moment, we'll be introducing our special guest speaker for this event today, Peter Gorsuch. Peter, how are you doing? Everything going okay?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thank you, Gareth.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's 6 a.m. here in Colorado, so might be a bit slow
Well, thank you very
in the
much.
first few minutes.
Thank you very much for joining us at such an early hour. It's absolutely fantastic. Do let us know if you're joining us today live in the Zoom room, like where you're from, like, you know, maybe we'd like to learn like a little bit more about you. We can send you some follow-up information. Of course, everybody joining this event today, goes without saying, will get a copy of the recording of this event and also a certificate. So recording, certificate, and follow-up. And I know that Dr. Peter's going to be talking about some of his own products and services as well. So, you know, don't forget to keep in touch. Peter, maybe we'll put your email in the chat box a little bit later on over the course of this event. So do let us know where you're from, how you're doing, like what's going on with you. And of course, we'll have time at the end of our event today as well for a Q&A. There'll be plenty of time for that. I'll be back for that a little bit later. So let's switch over now. Let's just make our friend Peter the host of this event so that he's able to share his slides, and we'll just hand over to Peter. And Peter, I'm sure you'll be happy to give an introduction. Welcome to this Reviewer Credits webinar. Thank you so much for doing it.
Well, thank you again for having me. No, it's a pleasure to be here. Let me just share my screen. Am I doing that? Share. Here we go. All right, so I think you can see the slides now appearing on your screen. Yeah, so yeah, thank you very much, Gareth. It's great to be here, and it's good to be doing webinars again. I've been doing webinars for maybe 10 years. Yeah. Our most recent one was probably with you, Gareth, I think, a little while ago, like I don't know if it was a year ago.
At that company that we're not going to talk about in this event.
So yeah, so it's great to be back. So just by way of background, I originally trained as a biologist, plant biologist, many years ago, and I had a few bits of work. I did some work in environmental pollution for a year. That was working for the equivalent of the EPA, and then joined Nature as a research editor on their Earth Sciences team. So that was a big jump. A very interesting, exciting job, making decisions on some of the most exciting research in the Earth Sciences. That was just a temporary position, and from then I decided to work on an editing service that Nature was just setting up. So it wasn't a language editing service, it was a content editing service, and it was all about writing the most effective papers possible. So things like argumentation, logic, emphasis, really getting the message across, what the message was, how it was getting across, how the research was described. Things like accuracy, things like strategy, and strategy is something that's highly relevant to today's talk about peer reviewers, getting an effective response, not just simply sending a response that answers some of the points they make, but actually really addressing the peer reviewers in a really convincing way. So that role was something that I had for 12 years. As Gareth mentioned, since then I've moved on, and I've started a new company which is focusing really heavily on that strategy side. So it's all about helping researchers, often one-to-one. So mostly things like consultation, working on people's papers in terms of the content, like adding lots of comments about the how it fits into its context, how it's getting the message across. There's a bit more on the sort of consultation-y strategy side, but still designed to be very accessible to individual researchers, and also training and presentations like this one. So I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, but I'm mostly going to be talking about how responding to peer reviewers. Don't worry, and let's get started. So I'm actually not just going to talk about the response, because I think that's I think the most important step about convincing reviewers is that peer review response. But you've got to get there first. You know, you've got to have work which is getting in front of peer reviewers, and also making their job a little bit easier in peer reviewing your paper and passing it through the process. Isn't just a case of looking at the response. Of course, they've got an original paper to review as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit across these, all of the stages, and get a little bit more general than the response. And even more general than that, I want to start off first by talking about the idea of perspective. So when you're writing a paper, you're often quite deep in the details. You're often thinking about individual protocols. You're thinking about your raw data. You're thinking about a particular paper that you read yesterday. You know, you're thinking from detail to detail, and that's part of the job of the researcher. You know, the reader is expecting the researcher to have a very strong grasp of the details. You are expected, of course, to have a more general view as well in your research paper. That's often a little bit more challenging for some researchers, at least. You know, it's part of the mindset. It's part of the research kind of task. Is you do have to be focused on the detail. So some researchers do find it difficult to take a step back, and that's really what I'm going to talk about here. Not so much the sort of writing general things in your paper, the context, but actually this sort of mindset of taking a step back. And I'm no psychologist, so this isn't going to be a sort of I'm not going to be able to reformulate your brain remotely, but I will give a few tips and some and at least outline some of the ways of doing this and some of the challenges. Now, the value of doing this, the value of building your own perspective, is so that you can generate your own feedback, and you can be receptive to feedback from other people, that you're able to take a step outside of your work, see it from the outside, even while still being one person. So this is a very, very valuable skill, and it's something that'll help in formulating the paper, writing it, you know, throughout that research cycle. And when you come to actually gain those external perspectives, when you gain other people's opinions, views, and criticisms of your work, then they'll hopefully have less to criticize, because you've already thought about it in a similar way yourself. So there's a few ways of doing this, and I've grouped them as ways that you can do it continuously, that you can work on just day to day, and also ways that you can that apply specifically during the writing process. So continuously, one of the main things, and this is kind of an obvious point, and you're doing it anyway, but this is highly relevant here, building your perspective, is to improve your understanding of things. So technical understanding. Your field, understanding your field, keeping up to date with the literature. That's one of the main things that peer reviewers bring, is they bring that sort of broader knowledge, or different knowledge of the field, of related fields. And it isn't just your field. It isn't just the sort of the specific topic or topics that you work in. It is this sort of broader understanding, broader knowledge. So any work that you're already doing that keeps you up to date with your field, and also gives you some insights into relevant other fields, it's going to help you here. It's going to help you build your perspective. And that includes, let's say you've got a paper that has applications. You've got some sort of insight into a process. Let's say it's a ecosystem process that might have relevance for carbon cycling. Well, having some awareness of carbon cycling and how that works in practice can help you formulate implications that are feasible, that are reasonable, and put those in your paper and frame them in a way that is that seems okay, that seems good for peer reviewers, that they'll think that this is an interesting point and a valid point, and not something that they're going to take issue with, that hasn't been thought through in a way that they would expect. Understanding journal and community requirements is also a really important aspect of improving your understanding. You know, what do people expect to see in a paper like yours? What do people expect to see in a really good paper like yours? You know, these kinds of things are very important to have an awareness of. And journal requirements are obviously, you know, those are written down, and I don't just mean one journal, by the way. I don't necessarily mean your one target journal. Yes, you might have a target journal in mind, and I think it's helpful to look at those, have some awareness of those without necessarily worrying too much early on. But it is good to be aware of those reasonably early. But not just that one journal, because you might not be published in that journal. Just maybe find a journal in your field that has a really good set of guidelines that is actually helpful to you, not just restricting. Those can be a way of getting the right ideas in your paper and presenting them in a way that's going to be helpful to others in the field. And there's no better example than this for this than community guidelines that are written down. Like some fields, and medicine is streets ahead of other fields in this, but some fields have community guidelines which are adhered to by lots of journals in the field. So, for example, Consort is a set of guidelines for clinical studies, that clinical trials that authors are expected to follow for specific journals, but there's also a general requirement in the community that people follow those. I think many of you in that field would be thinking, well, of course, you know, we all know about Consort, but having seen many hundreds of worked on many hundreds of clinical papers in the past, I can tell you that that's not the case. Actually, that a lot of draft papers don't really take these checklists, these guidelines into account particularly thoroughly. That there's often a lot that can be added by cross-referencing those. So just having an awareness of these and following them as you write, and as you do the research as well, that can really help you. So, for example, Consort might ask you how many people dropped out during the study, like how many of your participants withdrew. You've got to state that somewhere. And some of these things do have implications for study design and things as well. Things like, did you predetermine your sample size? Well, you can't predetermine that during the writing process. You know, you need to know that at the start. So having this kind of knowledge can prepare you for shocks or improve the quality of your research, to put it the other way, before you get anywhere near the peer review stage. Develop your logical instinct and self-questioning. I think this is going to be the hardest to pin down on this list. This isn't, you know, this is a little bit nebulous, a bit hard to describe, but it's easily illustrated in the endpoint. What happens when this doesn't, the logic is not sort of focused on, and this is something again that I've seen many times, is arguments, incomplete arguments, or arguments that sort of jump in logic. Let's say a discussion section. So obviously a whole research paper should lay out an idea, hypothesis, and objective with some context. It should investigate that idea, or describe the investigation with your methods and results, and it should resolve the idea with your discussion and conclusions. But that's the same with any argument, and at smaller scale as well. In your discussion, it's usually a good idea to start paragraphs with a new point, argue that point, and then reach a conclusion. So just the same idea, same kind of structure, but on a smaller scale. But so many papers don't do that. I mean, I think we've all read papers where the discussion section lists lots and lots of previous work, and then the paragraph just kind of ends, and you're left thinking, well, so what? Like, okay, there's like 7 references cited here, and they all seem interesting, but what does that tell us in relation to your study? So it's that kind of logic, building those skills to avoid dead ends like that for the reader, that'll improve your paper in general. And this is, I think that example I gave there, the reviewers might not prioritize those comments like this sort of logical argumentation in the discussion. That's not one of the main things that peer reviewers do, but it is still, the reviewers still absolutely do address logic in their comments often, and I think actually that's something that a good peer reviewer would be expected to do, is to address that side of things. So it's something that you can work on, build on. I think listening to feedback, identifying logical gaps as best you can in your own writing is a very good skill to have, and a little bit hard to work on, but definitely possible. Understanding people. Now, to build your own perspective, one of the most powerful things you can do is to understand other people's perspectives and be able to apply them yourself. So if you have a good network, if you're talking to people at conferences, you're reaching out to other researchers, you stay in touch with previous colleagues and so on, then that's going to help you, because you're going to be exposed to other viewpoints often. Managing, teaching, mentoring, and also being managed, being taught, mentoring, and actually interacting with those people that are leading you. Very, very powerful way of taking on other perspectives. And this is something that I've always been really keen on doing, and I've always tried to do is like I was a manager, and I ran this editing service, and I had a team, and I would try and think, well, what would so-and-so think? What would so-and-so do? The same with my manager. And different people have quite different outlooks and different skills and different sort of philosophies and how they approach work. So, for example, if you've got a colleague who's obsessed with process, and everything, they kind of lay things out, and all their documentation is very organized, and maybe yours is can be a little bit disorganized, a little bit sort of free and flowing, but can lack thoroughness. And ask yourself, what would this person think of this bit of the method section? What's missing? And I think being able to kind of take a step outside of your own perspective, even while just doing it yourself, without them actually being involved, is a really useful way of developing new insights. And the same with, if you can work in other labs, that kind of exchange of ideas can be really useful. When you're writing, I think one of the main things you can do, which is helpful, is to take breaks and just take a stop. If you're in the flow of writing, then keep going. Do take breaks, but they wouldn't necessarily have the same purpose exactly. They're not necessarily clearing your mind. They're more just sort of stopping you from getting exhausted. But especially if you feel things slowing down, you realize, well, I'm not making so much progress, then take a break. And I mean, a proper break where you're not thinking about work. Yes, if you stick your head out of the window and close your eyes and let the sunlight fall on your eyes, then that's something. But if you're able to take a bigger break, go for a little walk, whatever it is, then that can really help you, because it's a change of scenery, a change of pace. You're stopping thinking about the specific thing you're doing, and that can help you take a step back and get some breadth in your perspective, which is really very valuable. And you can I think even if you're not, and initially, I would say initially in your break, you shouldn't be thinking about work. If it comes back to you, then often it is a new insight that comes back to you. It is this new sort of new ideas can arise. So very important. And I know everybody always tells you that breaks are important, and it's hard sometimes to find the time and space. But I'm going to just join the ranks of all those people that are saying the same thing. Because it's important and very, very valuable, can save a lot of time by getting these sort of insights. Consider your work both in terms of each part and as a whole. I think that's a general kind of skill, which is particularly useful in writing. If you're, let's say you've got a set of results, you've got a bunch of statistical outputs that you've done, you have a sense of where what the trends are. It's very valuable to be able to take a few steps back and consider what they mean in the context of your main argument. It might be that also that there's something to be gained in comparing those with the literature, taking an even broader view beyond the work. So I think you'll recognize that as something that's very important when you're writing, when you're doing research, being able to develop that skill. And you'll notice a few times that I mentioned that it's helpful to make yourself think in a different way, to think about what would this other person I know think, what would a reviewer think, what would a critical reader think, what would someone who's in the field think. Arch nemesis. Okay, nobody's out to get you. You don't need to be defensive and worried and constantly arguing even the most minor point. But maybe they sometimes would hit on something that's a really critical point in a way that you can't escape. They bluntly say, but this isn't hanging together, is it? These two bits of the paper aren't. They seem like two different ideas completely. That kind of blunt perspective is actually, that can be very valuable and very helpful. So being able to actually force yourself to think of things in a new way can be part of this. Absolutely, can be very helpful. So anyway, this is sort of the more general ideas. I'm going to get into more specifics. Getting external perspectives is obviously at least as important. You want to be seeking feedback from other people as much as you can reasonably do so without, that's not going to be every day, every person, but at specific useful points. And listen to the feedback that you receive. It doesn't mean to say that you have to do what the person suggests. And then, asking colleagues, asking other researchers, the manufacturers. Let's say you've got an issue you're facing with a method, and there's a piece of equipment that's central to that method. Well, these days, customer services are pretty good, and a lot of sort of biotech manufacturers and related companies they want to help you use their equipment, and they might have their customer services might be willing to point you in the right direction. Just sort of be creative about who you ask. Support services, I mean, that's for writing. That's what I'm doing. That's the company I run. There may be other services for different aspects of the writing process, the research process. And online forums. This is all fairly obvious, and I'm sure you'll have all used forums at least as a reference source of people who faced similar problems. This is certainly, the availability of this kind of resource varies hugely depending on what we're talking about. If it's coding, then there's a vast amount of, there's so many people using at least the more common coding languages and applications that there's a huge body of research, but that's not always the case. You can ask, of course, in online forums. That's not something that I do very often, and maybe it's definitely shouldn't be an obstacle, though. Even if you're not sort of a forum user, you need to. That's certainly available to you and can be very valuable. So this is not exciting new stuff, but it's certainly worth bearing in mind, because you do want to get as many external perspectives or as useful external perspectives as you can before you get to peer review. Okay, so back to the research cycle. What do these things actually look like? Well, in study design, when you're applying for a grant or designing a particular bit of a study, you want to be asking the right questions, research questions. You want to have a scientifically useful objective in mind. You want to be able to place that in context appropriately with what research has already taken place. You know, it needs to be useful advance for people, for humankind. And having a sort of breadth of perspective there is super helpful, because reviewers will be interested in the same things. Using the right methods, selecting a method that's actually going to enable you to address the research question, and to using those methods correctly. Contingency planning, you know, if you're writing a grant application, often there'll be a specific section for preparing for any risks that might come up during that research process and how you're going to mitigate those risks. Sometimes the mitigation actually has to happen right at the start. You know, pre-selection of sample size is a good example. You know, if there's a risk that you're not going to have enough samples, then you need to prepare for that from the beginning, most likely. So some of these things, you don't want the reviewer to point out at the end of the process, when you've finished all your research, that there's something wrong here with these study design things, because that can often be a fundamental problem that can affect where you can publish your work, or indeed if you can publish your work in extreme cases. So yes, being able to, you know, having, you know, don't lose sight of these things. Of course, you're aware of them already. In the actual research process, you need to obviously follow your plan, use those methods that you plan to use if they are the right methods, but things change. So, you know, flexibility is important too. So all these things, absolutely central to being a researcher anyway, but one of the main things that they can do is help you prepare for successful peer review. Let's get on to writing. So I'm going to go a bit more detail about writing than these other things. For the writing process, you want to come up with a document that gives a thorough account of what you did, doesn't miss things out. You want to write for other people, not yourself. It's a communication tool. Your research paper, in particular, is to help people who have no knowledge of the study already, and they probably aren't quite like you. They don't have your educational research background. They might be in a different culture. They have different needs to you for things like explanations, definitions. So it's extremely important to never lose sight of that you're writing for readers. And particularly among those readers, it's helpful to think about your critical readers, because that's what a peer reviewer is. They are a critical reader. They are told to be critical. That's kind of their job. But a lot of readers will be doing exactly the same thing when they read the paper for themselves. They're kind of doing a little subconscious or conscious review of the paper and making sure that your evidence base is sound and that your conclusions are reasonable, etc. So having those people in mind during the writing process can be extremely valuable. So what are readers actually going to do with the information that they read? I think it helps to break it down in the following ways. People who want to understand why you did your study, people who want to replicate all aspects of your study themselves, and that might be to build on it, not necessarily one person redoing the whole thing. Different readers might redo different bits of the study, and someone might want to build on it, on your study. They'll take sort of most of it or all of it and do extra work on top. You know, that's a very realistic, although replicate all aspects doesn't sound necessarily like people will do that. They might, and certainly your readership might well do that together. evaluate the evidence base, and place your conclusions into context. So those are the main 4 aims, I think, that you want to satisfy. That's the people you want to satisfy when you're writing your paper. And you'll see that breaks down into basically introduction, methods, results, and discussion. And you're answering questions such as, what was the point of your study in the introduction? And what was the focus of your study as well? How was it done? How can I do it? What are your findings and why should I trust them? And what does it all mean for me? You know, what's for the field? What does it tell us that we didn't know already? Those are the kinds of questions that we have to satisfy in the discussion. Peer reviewers will have the same questions, and in fact, you know, some journals have templates for peer reviewers to complete, and that's definitely something that's useful to obtain ahead of time. Journals will have that online if they have such a thing in the reviewer pages of their website. I think that's a useful thing to do, is to identify, do they have this sort of template for reviewers to fill in, or other guidance by which they're judging the paper. And they won't stop judging it in other ways, you know, they will give their opinion otherwise, but you know, there might well be questions like this in the template, which can help you think about what needs to be in the paper and the study indeed. Another key part of the overall argument is limitations. And this is really about beating the reviewers at their own game. You're adding your own criticisms to the writing, to the written input, that reviewers, you know, if they're reading the paper and they read your methods, and well, they haven't accounted for X, you know, they haven't considered that this might all be an artifact, all of these findings. Well, the limitations, which is often just before the conclusion. Usually there's like a paragraph of limitations just before the concluding paragraph. That's not the only way to do it. But they'll get to that, and then you'll argue about that point. You'll explain, you know, it might seem that we didn't account for X, but maybe it was unfeasible to do so. Let's say like a genetic study, and the necessary mutant would be lethal. That would be a kind of a classic example. We can't make that mutant because they would die. We wouldn't be able to experiment on them. Well, no reviewer is going to disagree with that point and make you do that. But maybe you can argue around it anyway and say, this is why we think the findings are valid anyway. Or why it doesn't matter at all, or whatever it is, you're arguing that point. Some limitations are a bit more prosaic, a bit more just a simple statement will do. So, for example, retrospective studies in clinical literature, you know, often they will just say that they're retrospective studies. That was a limitation, but they won't go into much detail because everybody kind of knows that already, and readers in that field will appreciate that. And that's not a kind of a critical limitation. It just needs to be stated, or is often useful to state to remind the reader. And in terms of the level of detail, it's really about whether the limitation is unusual, something that the reader might not think of otherwise. If it was something that came up that was a bit surprising, and above all, if it affects the conclusions of the study. And writing these limitations down, it helps you explain either why they don't really affect the conclusions of the study, or if they do, how they affect the conclusions. And of course, you'll want to make sure that where the conclusions are stated, that those statements of the conclusions don't conflict with the limitation, that the conclusions are stated in a way that the limitations apply. You know, if you can only comment on a certain system, then the conclusions would probably be limited to that system. They might make like a more speculative statement about how it might apply in general, but you want to make sure that the focus of readers is largely on that system, for example, depending on what we're talking about. Alternative explanations I put in here as well. That's often something that reviewers bring up. You know, they might review a paper and say, well, this is all very well, but I don't actually really buy into this argument at all, and nor does most of the field, that the author's thinking is quite unusual. They've come up with as an assumption for their work, they've come up with, you know, X process is kind of inevitable in whatever system that we're talking about, whereas actually most people don't believe that that's true. So even if the authors are actually right to think that it's inevitable, it still needs to be accounted for in the paper in whatever way. That might not just be in the limitations section, it might also be in the introduction, for example. But this kind of external accounting for external perspectives while you're writing, and particularly getting other people's input from in the field, that might have avoided that kind of conflict in the paper. That might have helped them come up with an argument that is not necessarily situated only in the alternative explanation. It could still have a strong it could still assume potentially that the author's explanation, even if it's unusual, is a valid assumption to make, but it would at least argue that point, and the reviewers usually would, depending on the actual details of the case, the reviewers will often be receptive to that. You know, they would be like, well, you know, assuming that the assumptions are right, then this is really interesting. I'm not sure they are, but the authors take a really good approach to that, and I don't really see that that's a problem in getting the paper published. You know, that's the kind of feedback that reviewers might give. I've got some examples here from real papers. We do not consider the possible emergence of Paxlovid-resistant viruses, although such variants have not yet been found in clinical trials. Broad use of Paxlovid could spur the emergence of drug resistance, as has been documented for other drugs. So here's the limitation. Our study design doesn't account for resistance, but it's never been observed before. So it's probably not a big deal at the moment, but it might be one day. So that's a kind of a nice short limitation from a real paper that is just like, yeah, we didn't account for it, but it probably doesn't matter right now for this study. So that's, I mean, you could actually phrase, you know, it's phrased as a limitation, which I think is fine, but it's almost like a strength, because resistance doesn't exist yet. So it's actually potentially a good system to study this in, that the risk, we don't have to worry about this potential variable that would complicate interpretation of the findings. Yeah, because it doesn't exist. Here's a slightly more detailed limitation, the second one. Women who experience severe side effects may be more likely to post their experiences on YouTube than women with no side effects or symptoms. So this is a study of a health issue that uses YouTube videos as an evidence base. Highly unusual, obviously. Thus, we don't know which of the data might be influenced by self-presentation. The reach of the videos may also have led women to be less open about this sensitive topic than, for example, face-to-face interviews. So this limitation actually is more important than the first, in that it actually affects the potential validity of the data set they're using. So yes, using YouTube videos, it's unusual, but it's actually potentially some interesting insights to be gained from things like that, that would be quite different to the evidence base that you get in other ways. So there's definitely, you can see there might be interest there, but at the same time, it is what it is. It's a specific type of evidence base, and it does affect how we interpret the conclusions. And you'd expect that the authors presumably explain their conclusions, maybe in terms of YouTube videos rather than the health issue itself. I don't know how they do that in the actual paper, but the paper might still present some interesting insights. Okay, so this kind of declaration helps to prepare reviewers. It helps to get through the review process by doing the reviewer's work for them in a constructive way in the paper itself. I don't know whether these statements were added due to peer review or if they were already in the paper. So I don't know that. Let's talk about the peer review response. That is obviously critically important to getting the paper through the process. And one of the ways of seeing that is to make people's jobs easier, which I know isn't necessarily very inspiring, but it's true. You want to make the reviewer's job easier. They are, after all, I mean, they are also researchers. They're also very busy, but they don't know your work already. And being able to put your work kind of on a plate for them and making it easy and available to them, the points that they may or may not make, that will help you get through the process. It also makes the editor's job easy in sort of giving the thumbs up. So when you get a set of reviews, now obviously you're going to examine the reviews. What is a little bit harder sometimes is to figure out which comments from the reviewers actually were responsible for the rejection. So not just sort of critical comments in general, but which ones are the reasons why the paper was rejected. So usually that is something around the logic of the study of the paper at a fundamental level. The novelty or the importance of the conclusions, the fundamental robustness of the methods, the data analysis or discussion. You know, you might get a bunch of comments about the methods, but one might actually affect the editor's confidence in the paper as a whole. That's much more likely to be the reason for rejection. And by figuring this out, then you can work out your next steps. So you might actually have been rejected outright without an opportunity to revise and resubmit. But regardless of that, you can still figure out, you can still sort of go through the comments and figure out which ones of these affect the sort of the paper at a fundamental level, because that you might want to appeal. You know, if you can address, if there's only one fundamental comment, and you had the sort of the door slammed on your face by the journal editor, and you think that you can address that one comment, then that might be grounds for an appeal. Or more likely, you might want to think about the comments and go to a different journal. But the process is still much the same, or it can be. You can potentially ask the editor if it's unclear what comments led to the rejection. I think you want to have quite a good look at it first, and the part of the reason being that different editors have different levels of tolerance for this kind of thing. Most editors, I think, want to help authors, but I think also most editors would also not really be able to do the author's job in terms of figuring out the reviews. A lot of editors are not taking a very active part in the review process, in that they'll look through the reviews and be like, oh, that's a reject. You know, they're not the level of investment in peer reviewers' comments is variable. So I do think this should be used sparingly, but it's still available to you. And some editors actually really go out of their way to help authors, because they don't want the authors to be wasting a whole load of time doing something that might not be necessary, just the same as you. So it can be done, and I would recommend it if there's sort of on a particular paper you're really unsure about what to do, and it's because of the comments. Let's do a poll. Gareth, I'm not sure how we do this poll. Is that something that you can bring up? Let's see, polls. Oh yeah, here we go. Launch. All right, I can do it. Okay, so you should have a poll appearing in front of you, which this is a fictional paper. Okay, so the paper's been peer reviewed, and we want to know which of these comments probably led to the paper being rejected. So I'll read them out. The practical relevance of the work is obvious, but the paper doesn't state it. Don't we already know most of this from reference 4? You know, most of the main findings. Don't we already know this? The methods contain several sentences of plagiarized text. The wrong statistical test was used. Is such and such a statement about your study, or is it about previous work? This paper reads like two completely different studies in one paper. Reference 8 isn't cited anywhere in the paper, and it would be interesting to discuss such and such a topic. So have a go at this. Fill in. You should be able to tick multiple options, as far as I'm aware. If you can do that, please do so. So have a little go through that. I'll give you sort of 20 seconds to fill that in. Okay, I think we've got a sort of a decent level of responses here. Okay, so we've got the import. Sorry if you hadn't had the chance to complete that. Let's have a look. We can share results. There we go. Okay, so the practical relevance is obvious, but the paper doesn't state it. Well, if the practical relevance is obvious, then the reviewers realized what it was, what the practical relevance was, even though it wasn't stated. So that wouldn't have contributed to the rejection, most likely. Don't we already know most of this from reference 4? That affects the novelty of the work. I'm going to move to my own answers here. So I think that's probably the most important one. We don't know the details, so this is all open to interpretation. Because if the paper says they found, something new, and actually a whole bunch of it isn't actually new, then that means that we get much less out of this paper than the authors were saying. Which I think that really is likely, as long as it's a journal that makes its decisions based partly on novelty, then that's quite likely to contribute to rejection. So most people chose that. The methods contain several sentences of plagiarized text. This is a sneaky one because the method sections often contain plagiarized text, and usually the author will be told to change it. But that's it. They won't be penalized, and they wouldn't be rejected. That's something that can be fixed without rejection. So I would say that although that's actually the most common one, and it is obviously something the author shouldn't be doing, but it probably wouldn't actually contribute to the rejection. They'd just be told to fix it without rejection. The wrong statistical test was used. Actually, let's skip. There we go. I think this entirely depends on context. Yes, if it's one of the main findings, then that would be the grounds for rejection. If it's supplementary figure 11, then no, it wouldn't. I think it comes down to that. So yes, it very, very likely, it's very possible that would be a reason. Is such and such a statement about your study or previous work? That's presentation. They can just answer that question in the paper, unless it's like the main finding, but that's not going to be one statement. So that's probably not a reason for rejection. This reads like two completely different studies in one paper. That is a presentational issue as well. So you could say, well, that doesn't matter so much as the findings. But two completely different studies, that's a pretty critical issue. So I'd say that's pretty likely to be a reason for rejection. Ref 8 isn't cited anywhere. It doesn't really matter. They just need to put that in or delete the reference. And it would be interesting to discuss. It would be interesting, but is it necessary? Presumably not, or they would say that. So again, that's probably not going to be super important for the decision. So you'll see that I've put those on a kind of a chart of more important versus less important. We've also got potential misunderstandings, that there are things that referee misunderstood and things that were unclear. There were none really in this case. I've also put them on another axis, which is how easy to fix are they and how hard to fix are they. And I think rationalizing the comments you get when you get them back in this way or a similar way can be a really helpful way, particularly if the comments are a bit overwhelming. Can be a helpful way to have a good overview of them and understand what needs to be done. And I would literally write them down on some sticky notes and stick them to a wall. That would be kind of a good way of starting to understand what you've received and how to prioritize them, group similar comments together from different referees, and so on. So the sort of visual approach can work nicely. All right, I'm going to pick up the pace because I'm falling behind. So addressing the comments. If you decide to resubmit appeal, you need to make sure that you substantively address all of the comments in some way. So what do I mean by substantively? I mean, take each comment seriously and do something substantial to directly resolve it, whatever that means, whatever that something might be. All of the comments, don't omit any comments, respond thoroughly, and in some way. You might not have to do further experimental or work or simulations or whatever, and you might not have to do exactly what the reviewer suggests, but it has to be a substantive response. So in most cases you do, and certainly if you receive a set of comments and you mostly don't do what the reviewer suggests, then you're very likely to be rejected outright. And that was something I saw at Nature a few times at least, was I'd get a response from the authors and it would be, they would explain how they really didn't do much to the paper since it was reviewed. And at Nature, that's another desk rejection. I would reject that as an editor without sending it back for review to reviewers at all, because it's clear that the authors hadn't really taken the criticism on board for whatever reason. Well, they would explain their reasons, but if it wasn't convincing, then I wouldn't send it back out. What about reviewers being wrong? I mean, of course that happens, and reviewers are human. So first of all, read through the papers, the comments with a clear mind. You might want to sleep on it, talk about the comments with someone else. Did you understand their comment correctly? And that might not be your fault reading the comment. It might be that their writing isn't very clear. So sometimes that happens, not very often, but it's worth checking first of all whether there's some sort of misunderstanding between you and the reviewer, and then conversely, is the paper itself clear enough? Is there something confusing in the paper? Do you assume too much prior knowledge in the paper? Is there something that can be improved there that's to do with the presentation that would avoid that misunderstanding? Because if your reviewers might make the same error, then there is a very good reason to clarify the paper, even if the reviewer is completely wrong. If there's a basis for that misunderstanding in the paper, then correct it. And I think that's when in doubt, correct the paper, even adding a definition in parentheses or something, even if you don't really see why it's necessary. That's a very easy way of responding to the reviewer, addressing their comment and keeping them happy, even if you're like, it's not super necessary. You don't want to make the paper worse. So for basic misunderstandings, explain the error politely in your response. That's fine. In fact, I would definitely recommend it. You want to make this process easy for everybody. So when you're writing your response, include all of the reviewers' comments in full. Every bit of their review should be in your response. Even if you don't respond to a whole bunch of it, where they're saying this study is about X, it's that you don't need to respond to that. That's fine. but it shows that your response is comprehensive, that where you do respond, you're taking into account all of their comments, and it makes it so much easier for the editor and the reviewer to see that you're responding to everything. I handle papers where the whole review wasn't included, and I then had to literally cross-reference between two documents all the way through, trying to figure out, did they leave anything out? And I think there was probably one case where the authors actually hadn't included all the comments and they weren't responding thoroughly, and they were kind of hiding that by not including all the initial reviews in their response. Use signposting and really add line numbers to your paper, and continue that through the pages, so it goes up to sort of hundreds of lines, and that really helps reviewers focus on your changes. It helps them really quickly find them. Use formatting to differentiate between comment, response, and revisions. Again, it's just so that reviewers can very easily check how you responded, both in terms of arguing your case and in terms of what revisions you made. And find the appropriate tone. You want to be polite and professional. You don't have to compliment them all the way through the document. That's not necessary at all. But be sort of on the generous side of sort of neutral. You want to be nice. And I think most people would be totally fine with that. There's a cultural difference here, and certainly in general the idea of response to criticism is there's all kinds of interesting sort of social cultural things that come into play. The stereotypically the sort of American male author is often, and Australian male authors can be a little short on temper, and there is some sub-regions, some sort of Asian countries. Sometimes it's the other extreme, that the authors can be too deferential. It can be sort of overly respectful, and sometimes there's a risk that the author isn't making their case, is letting the reviewers take control. And actually neither of those things is ideal. You want to be in the middle somewhere. I think most authors actually are fine including in those regions, but it's worth taking into account. Okay, so I've got an example here I'm going to do quickly. You can see that the comment, the gray text, you can just ignore. That's why I've put it in gray. It would be in black in the actual response. Another uncertainty in this study is that other effects must be excluded. The reviewer misses a clear and conclusive description of how this was done. The response is in blue. We thank the reviewer for raising an important point. The modification in the main, and then they explain that point, their response, and then they say the main modification, the main manuscript in line 152 is indicated below. And there it is in red, in quotation marks. You've got their response written down in the response. Even though that's just text from the paper, they've put it in the response as well, so that the reviewer can just read these 3 paragraphs, and they don't even have to cross-reference with the paper at all if they don't want to. So that makes it super easy for the reviewer to follow. I thought possibly too polite. We thank the reviewer for raising an important point. That's not really too polite, but you don't have to respond every point with saying thank you, thank you, thank you. And this is an amazing point, wonderful point. That's not really necessary. You can just put, for minor changes, particularly, updated in the revised file or something, as long as you've said sort of thank you earlier. That's not rude to give a short response. Okay. All right, about time. Thank you very much for, we do have a few minutes for questions. If you do want some further help with anything relating to papers, including yes, Gareth has already put it in. Awesome, thank you, Gareth.
I've been pasting your email and your website throughout the event.
Brilliant, thank you so much.
Hopefully we'll get some feedback from people. Yeah, I mean, that was great. We learned a lot. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Please paste them in the chat, or even raise your hand if you'd like to be unmuted. Yeah, someone's asking, Aman is asking, Dr. Shrivastava is asking, how can I put attractive feedback? You mean about this event or attractive feedback about papers? I think he's asking about papers, Peter.
As a reviewer, I mean, there are lots of, we don't have time to go into leaving reviews, but particularly now that my presentation took longer than I was expecting. But there are lots of resources online for reviewing, and I imagine that would I be right in saying that ReviewerCredits has guidelines on that kind of thing? There you go.
We do, and we have some other webinars and other training on our YouTube. I'll paste that again for you, everybody in the chat. This event as well will be released on a YouTube link. Yeah, but if you want to get more information, get in touch with Peter. I mean, I'm sure he's happy to share with you like the slides and things if you get in touch with him.
Yep. Yeah, so I think that's a great starting point, ReviewerCredits. Any other questions about how to convince reviewers, how to put a strong argument across about how polite to be?
Yeah,
what happened?
My questions were about how to disagree. Like, you mentioned that though. I wrote that down like quite early on. What do you do if you actually strongly disagree with a comment with a reviewer?
That's a good question. We've got another question. Okay, this is a really good one as well. I'm going to do this one first and then Gareth's. How we handle reviewers' comments about experiments that were not in scope of the study, but the reviewer suggested these experiments. We could actually roll these two together because you strongly disagree that you should be expected to do that experiment. It's actually not what you set out to do. If we assume that the comment is unreasonable, it does sound like that's the point of that question, that this idea that we should do further experiments. This is actually a big problem with peer review, and that was particularly, when I was at Nature, reviewers had very high standards, and they expect a lot of. They often do call for a lot of further work to be done, and it's not always reasonable, or at least it's not reasonable for all journals. I suppose you could argue that Nature should all have a higher standard for this kind of thing, but I don't know that that's necessarily the case, to be honest. It's about the logic, isn't it? And you should use logic in your response. You should be explaining, our main objective was X, and restate it and identify how that comment relates to the main objective, which presumably is that it doesn't. So being able to lay out logically this seems like a fascinating avenue of research, and giving them credit for making an interesting point, but arguing how that doesn't fit within the logic, and it's not the evidence from that wouldn't underpin our study objective. I think that would be the way to go in that case. In all cases, you do need to use logic and obviously not use emotion. Even if a review is rude to you, you never want to be sort of stray from your professional and sort of fairly polite tone in your response.
We got another question too from Dr. Dutta. How to answer if a reference has done similar work, but still our study is relevant because it's conducted with patients belonging to different ethnicities, demographies. Yeah, that's a great question also. It's a good question. I've seen it often, and it doesn't just apply for clinicals or patient studies on people as well. There's often a parallel to this in other fields. So our similar work has been done in different systems, but our study is in the new system, and that's useful, right? That needs to be in the paper. It needs to be very clear from the start of the paper that this is a study that we know X from other systems, but we don't know whether it applies to system Y, and that's what this is important because we set out to evaluate it system Y, and then you can discuss it in that context. You can refer to those other similar studies
in other systems in your discussion section and the introduction, but you can, but that needs to be a framing for the whole paper. So I think it's a very valid criticism if the paper doesn't do that, if it doesn't frame the paper in terms of the similar work that already exists and the new insights that come out from applying it to the new system. That needs to be the focus of the paper. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say that it undermines the whole paper.
Fantastic, fantastic. I mean, more questions, please paste them. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. Yeah, Kelsey's asking, how effective are appeals, and is it worth the effort? Well, you know it, Peter, as an editor. Like,
yeah.
is it worth the effort?
Well, I mean, I used to get a lot of appeals, and some of them succeeded. I can't remember what the pass rate was. Maybe a third of appeals. So that's not a tiny number. You know, that's pretty good. Yeah, it's essentially the editor is acting on the information that's available to them, provided by the reviewers. So they're kind of they're doing what they can based on the information that's available, and sometimes the information isn't wholly reliable. So that's usually the most effective way of appealing, is that a reviewer has made an error, and it might not be a factual error. They might have sort of exaggerated the importance of something, or you might think they have, something like that. And if you've got a logical basis you can argue that point, then they can be highly effective, as long as the journal allows appeals. I think some journals don't allow appeals, in which case they're probably not going to be effective. But I would say if you feel that you have grounds for appeal and that you can make that case, appeal. So yes, it can be worth the effort. It won't necessarily be worth the effort. I mean, you know, if you're worried about being delayed, you know, you're under very strict time constraints, that kind of external factor comes into play. You know, it might not be worth the effort. I can't tell that. But I would say if you feel you've been sort of that something has gone wrong in the process and that you can argue against it, and you want to appeal, then do so. Definitely do so. It's a very important part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Better to be in than not. I mean, the worst that can happen is that the paper stays rejected, right? I mean, we're going to have to wrap things up, ladies and gentlemen, at that point. But thank you very much, Dr. Peter, for joining us today and for such a insightful and useful webinar. We'll share the recording and certificates with everybody after the event, and hopefully see you again soon for more Reviewer Credits webinar events. Thanks very much, Peter. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.